Hello, this is the lecture for Ingrid Robeyns' article, What, If Anything, is Wrong with Extreme Wealth? So the topic of this article is political philosophy. This is the first political philosophy reading that we have. It might be the last one, depending on what we vote for. Political philosophy is my favorite kind of philosophy. It's the kind that I work on. And it's a huge field, like many fields in philosophy. It's about how we should sort of get along with each other and broadly speaking. So, how should the government function? Should we even have governments in the first place? Uh, what makes it okay for the government to do the things that the government ought to do? Is there a best form of government? Is democracy the best form of government? What are the rules governing war between states? Should people be able to freely immigrate back and forth across state borders? Should people have a right to secede from states? What level of tax should there be? And so on and so forth. Lots of questions, lots of interesting things to ask about in political philosophy. The topic of this article is a very popular topic in political philosophy, especially in the past few decades, and it's something called distributive justice. So, distributive justice is basically the question of look, one of the big things that the government does is it sort of distributes resources among people. So, it taxes people, it takes money from people, and then it spends that money. And that money that it spends doesn't go into the fire, it goes into people's pockets. And so what the government is doing is that it's taking money from some people and giving money to other people. And it's not just money that the government redistributes or distributes. The government distributes or redistributes all sorts of resources in society. So food, either directly or through subsidizing the purchase of food from farmers. It distributes education. It distributes education opportunities. In government-run colleges, there might be limited slots. It distributes jobs. There are government jobs. All sorts of things that governments are in charge of. And so the question of distributive justice is, what is the just way to do this? What is the right way to do this? What is the sort of justifiable way for the government to distribute these resources? And what we're going to get in this article is one sort of discussion of this topic. You can tell from the title that her argument is going to be, well, among the various things the government should be doing, there should be a cap on how much wealth anybody can get. And so while we're talking about distributive justice, it would be nice to take a look at maybe one of the most famous views about distributive justice in philosophy, because it pops up in this article. I say one of the most famous in the past few decades when this has been a very sort of hot topic. And Robeyns points this out on the bottom. She talks about this thing called the Rawlsian difference principle in a slightly modified form, but she doesn't really tell you much or anything, I suppose, about the Rawls's principle. She does give a brief discussion of it here on 261. So she says, in Rawls's theory, the difference principle states that in the design of the basic social and economic institutions in society, inequalities in social primary goods are allowed as long as they benefit the worst off groups in society. So lots of sort of things to parse here. First, we're talking about the design of the basic social and economic institutions in society. So we're asking, how should like the sort of fundamental pillars of society be designed? Like the government, like the tax laws in broad strokes and the constitution of the government and things like this, like the very important institutions in society. One question is sort of how big does this stretch? Does it just cover like official government institutions, or does it also cover things like, family structures? So family structures make a big difference on how resources get distributed. A family might give all of its resources to its firstborn son, or it might give all of its resources to its sons and none to its daughters, or it might distribute its resources equally. And so one question is whether distributive justice is a question about how families do things or just a question about how governments do things. When Rawls talks about the basic social and economic institutions in society, he does include the family. So that's one interesting view about this sort of Rawlsian difference principle. He thinks society, including family structures, should be set up in a certain sort of way. So first, that's sort of what this view applies to. It's the basic social and economic institutions in society. And the view says that inequalities in social primary goods are allowed as long as blah, blah, blah. So what are social primary goods? Basically, the sort of resources that you need to live a flourishing life. So often that's wealth, but whatever you need to sort of live a good life are the primary goods. And then Rawls also includes the social bases of self-respect. So whatever you need in society to sort of respect yourself, whatever resources it takes to sort of feel like you're a like full member of society and stuff like that. He thinks those are the things that we should care about. That's what we care about being redistributed. It's whatever it allows people to live flourishing lives where they sort of feel respect for themselves. What exactly does that take? I mean, not a lots of things to talk about, but we'll skip over that. And so we have these social primary goods like wealth and perhaps other things as well. And we're asking how the basic social and economic structures in society should divide up these primary goods. And she says, according to the Rawlsian difference principle, inequalities are allowed as long as they benefit the worst off groups in society. So the basic thought is, look, the default should be equality. Rawls has lots of arguments for this, but the most basic argument is, look, we come together in society to sort of do better. We create society because we want to be better off in society than we would be without other people. And the only way you can benefit from society is if everybody's doing their part. You're not getting anything out of society if you're the only one putting anything in. You're getting stuff out of society because everybody's putting things in. Some people are contributing more, some people are contributing less. But the whole structure itself depends on the people in it. You can't have a society alone. And so the thought is, well, the goods that society is producing should be equally distributed to everybody. Everybody's an equal member of society. It's that there's no justification for giving one person more than any other person, except if, let's say, you could make the worst off person better by giving someone else more. Then who would have a cause to complain? Because if you're all equal, nobody has a cause to complain. But if you give one person more and that makes the worst off person better, the worst off person is not going to complain because they're doing better off. The person you give more to is not going to complain. And then anybody else has no cause for complaint because they're not the worst off. Why should they get resources when someone else is worse off than them? And so what is an example where giving the money or wealth or resources to somebody else would make the worst off better? Well, let's say you have a society where everybody has equal resources and you don't have enough doctors. It would be nice to have more doctors, but it's a very hard job. You have to study very hard. It's a lot of responsibility. The work hours are very tough. So not a lot of people want to be doctors. The government could say, look, we're going to raise the salary for doctors, or we're going to lower the taxes on doctors, whatever it is. We're going to give more, we're going to distribute more to the doctors. And then more people will want to be doctors. So more people will choose to be doctors. And this will be better for everybody in society, including the worst off. The worst off will sort of get better healthcare and live happier lives if there are more doctors. So this would be a justification for doctors earning more than the rest of us in this society. It's because it's good for the worst off, and the worst off can't complain. And nobody else can complain because they're doing better than the worst person. And certainly the doctor is not going to complain. So that's the Rawlsian difference principle. The default is equal distribution unless inequality would make the worst off better. So that's a sort of theory about distributive justice. We'll see a competing theory about distributive justice in this paper called limitarianism. So that ends the big ideas. I wanted to point out two sort of philosophical things in the article. So the first, you'll notice end note number 2 on page 264. She says, this paper is on economic limitarianism. That is, limitarianism in economic resources, income and wealth. The idea of limitarianism more generally refers to upper limits on the possession, use, or enjoyment of valuable resources, and hence could be applied to other scarce valuable resources, such as natural resources. In this paper, every use of limitarianism should be read as referring to economic limitarianism. So this is something you're probably, depending on what readings we pick, you'll probably see this quite a lot in the readings for this class, which is they'll use some sort of term, and then they'll be very explicit about telling you what that term means. And they'll say something like, oh, you might think some people use this term to mean some other stuff, but I'm not using that term to mean those other things. I'm using it to mean this stuff. So she's saying, look, I know limitarianism is a word that can apply to lots of things. I'm not using limitarianism to talk about all of these things. When I use that word, I'm only referring to economic limitarianism, and I'm telling you right here what economic limitarianism is, so you can be very clear. So every time in your head you see limitarianism on the page, you should replace it with economic limitarianism. So it's very important to keep track of these sorts of things, like note them down in your notes or something, or your outline of the paper when you're reading, or put them in perusal or something. You want to keep track of these things because these are the authors giving you clues about what are they saying. I mean, it's not like a clue, it's not a mystery. They're explicitly telling you, this is how to read me, this is what's going on in my paper. And it's very easy if you're not used to reading philosophy or not used to reading academic articles generally, but like especially philosophy, it's very easy to, if you don't take note of these things and keep them very prominent in your head, it's easy to forget this. And then, you get to page 10 or something and you're reading limitarianism and you're thinking, this doesn't make sense if it's about limits on like natural resources or something. And it's, well, you forgot, she's not talking about that kind of limitarianism. She's only talking about a sort of narrow kind. So always, whenever an author is very explicit about saying, this is what I mean by some term or another, always keep that in your head when you're reading what they're saying. And then finally, this idea of pro tanto and all things considered and prima facie reasons and judgments. So as she puts it here, this is endnote number 3. Pro tanto reasons are reasons that provide some support for a normative claim. However, there may be other pro tanto reasons that provide a counterargument against the same claim. The ultimate answer to the question of whether one should endorse that claim is therefore only possible after an all things considered judgment, in which all the relevant pro tanto reasons are considered together. So the idea is a pro tanto reason is some reason in favor of doing something, but just because you have a reason in favor of doing something doesn't mean you should do the thing. So if you're hungry and there's a sandwich sitting there, the fact that the sandwich will make you less hungry, that's a pro tanto reason to eat it. That counts in favor of eating it. That's one consideration we can say that supports eating the sandwich. But that doesn't mean you should eat the sandwich. There might be reasons not to eat the sandwich. Maybe the sandwich belongs to somebody else. Maybe the sandwich is very unhealthy or it has something you're allergic to. There are lots of reasons maybe not to eat the sandwich. And so when you're deciding what should you ultimately do, or what argument should you ultimately believe or whatever, you don't just look at the pro tanto reasons. You have to weigh them all against each other and figure out what do we call this sort of all things considered reason or the all things considered judgment. So all things considered, do you have a reason to eat the sandwich? Maybe yes, maybe no, it depends. So that's pro tanto and all things considered. A third category that sometimes you'll see is a prima facie reason. So some people use pro tanto and prima facie as like basically the same thing. Like they'll just use them interchangeably, or they'll say prima facie when they mean pro tanto, or pro tanto when they mean prima facie, whatever. Like these are not like super duper technical terms for a lot of people. If someone is drawing a distinction between them, usually, really 99% of the time, what they mean is a pro tanto reason is what I talked about. It's something that counts in favor of doing the thing. A prima facie reason is something that sort of maybe counts in favor of doing the thing, but if all things considered you should not do the thing, then the prima facie reason sort of goes away. It sort of vanishes. So for instance, in the sandwich case, it's always going to be the case that, the sandwich is going to make you less hungry. So that's always something you can say in favor of the sandwich. So that's a pro tanto reason. Even if you shouldn't eat the sandwich, there is something we can say on its side, like you should eat the sandwich. A prima facie reason is something that sort of goes away when it's outweighed. So for instance, the fact that the sandwich was expensive, for instance. You might think, well, you don't want to waste expensive food. So that's a prima facie reason in favor of eating the sandwich. Look, it was an expensive sandwich. But if it turns out, well, it's actually not your sandwich. That wasn't your money that was spent, and it wasn't purchased for you. It was purchased for someone else. Then the fact that the sandwich is expensive is no reason for you to eat it. It wouldn't, it doesn't help you at all to eat that sandwich because there's no longer a question of wasting money on it or not, because it's not your money. Nobody spent the money on you. So a prima facie reason is something that sort of looks like it's a reason in favor of the thing, but it might not actually be if it turns out, you shouldn't do the thing. It's not super important to keep this in mind. Usually if someone distinguishes between pro tanto and prima facie, they'll tell you, because again, this is not like a universally accepted thing or a universally used thing. But but there are like useful terms to keep track of. Somebody might use them both and not tell you that there's a difference, so this is good to know. And this is noted, the glossary on my website has these terms there. So if you ever forget prima facie, pro tanto, all things considered, you can check out the glossary on my website. So go do that.